Hello and welcome to episode 6 of Tool Time with Professor Levy. Today we are going to gear up our shop and get ready for building the scenery for our outdoor fashion show, Rock the Runway. We're going to change the blades on the circular saw, apply a new collet and router bit to our router, new blade for the table saw, and a new blade for the chop saw. I apologize for the dubbed over voice for this episode. Continuing my week of technological problems, most of these clips did not record with the audio in them. The first tool that we are going to change the blade on is going to be the circular saw. I really like the way this saw has been set up because every tool that I need to change the blade on the saw is integral to the saw. There is a Allen key that fits into the blade and allows me to undo the lock. I've taken the battery out of the saw just to ensure that while I change the blade, I can't accidentally turn the saw on. This is the Allen key that pulls out of the saw and it allows us to change the blade. I'm going to set the foot of the saw completely down here so that I'm able to access the blade much easier. I've locked the blade with a button so it doesn't move. So I've dropped the foot of the saw. Now I have access to the entire blade. Again, with my left hand, I'm going to depress the button and be able to lock the blade of the saw from spinning. I'm struggling here because the saw has tightened from use. Our saws are all threaded counter to their turning so that when the saw spins, it actually tightens the blade, not loosens it. Here I'm taking the bolt out. And the blade just lifts off. What I'm doing here is showing you the difference between a new blade and the worn old blade. Clearly you can see that these blades from the same manufacturer have worn. The blade in my left hand used to be the bold black and gold colors of DeWalt that the other one was. Here I'm inspecting the teeth of the saw to see what kind of damage has happened to them. It's a little bit blurry, but you can see that the center tooth there has been knocked out. This blade's in pretty rough shape. More teeth missing. So when we put this new blade in, we're going to be able to cut much more effectively. It just sits over the bolt. The plate goes back on, and the nut goes on. We tighten that down finger tight, and then lock it down hard with the Allen key. This saw has probably had about 2 years of use without a blade change, so it's well and truly time. Now I'm going to go get a piece of plywood and we're going to perform a test cut to see how the blade change has affected the saw's cutting ability. And with the new blade, it's cutting through like it's nothing. The next tool I want to talk about is our router. We are going to replace this 3/4 inch mortising bit with a much longer 2.5 inch mortising bit. I demonstrated in last week's video this 3/4 inch bit isn't deep enough to go through our router jig that we made, so I'm going to replace it with this 2.5 inch mortising bit. This router comes with 2 wrenches that fit around the indentations on the collar there. It's again counter threaded, and we loosen it. What we're loosening is called the collet. Now I can pull the router bit out. I'm showing you here how burnt and used and chipped this 3/4 inch bit is, so we're going to be able to cut much more smoothly and effectively with the new bit. These are the 2 bits here that we will be using for building the runway. What I'm illustrating here is the difference in the shank size of the router bits. The 2.5 inch bit that I'm holding in front of the camera is indexed and has a much thicker shank to it than the bit that is in my left hand, the 3/4 inch mortising bit. The 3/4 inch mortising bit has a 1/4 inch shaft to it, and the 2.5 inch bit that I just bought has a 1/2 inch shaft to it. The thicker the shaft, the more stable the router bit is, particularly with this really long bit, so it's going to get rid of vibration and chatter in all of our routing that we do. Okay, so now I'm going to take off the collet that held the 1/4 inch router bit. I'm going to replace the 1/4 inch collet with the 1/2 inch collet that I have here in my hand. The 1/2 inch collet obviously is sized to fit the 1/2 inch bit, but the 1/2 inch bit won't go in the 1/4 inch collet, and subsequently the 1/4 inch bit will just dance around inside the bigger collet. So the collets are specific to the router bits that we place in them, and that just threads onto the shaft of the router, and the router bit slides in. And then with my wrenches again, I'm going to tighten down the collet onto the router bit. Again, it's counter threaded, so as the router bit spins, it will tighten itself. And that is changing the router bit on the router. The next tool that we are going to change the blade on is going to be the table saw here. The table saw is also very well designed in terms of the tools for changing the blades of it ride on it all the time, so you don't have to go searching for them, and they're right there. They sit on the front plate and on the side plate. It too, like all the other saws, is counter threaded so that as it spins, it tightens the blade. The first thing I'm going to do here is move the fence of the saw out of the way. Now I am going to remove the blade guard and faceplate of the saw. There are 2 anti-kickback devices on either side of the blade guard. I'm lifting them up and out of the way. I'm being careful while I do this because they're very sharp, and they have more than one time slapped back down and gouged my fingers. This anti-kickback devices allow you to feed the lumber through the saw, but the teeth dig into the lumber if it tries to come back towards you. So they're a great safety feature, but they easily interfere with your hands and fingers. I just loosened the clamp for the saw and I'm placing the guard on the table. Now I am going to raise the height of the blade to its full height so I can easily access the bolt and the nut on either side of the saw blade. I'm grabbing one of the wrenches, the other wrench is on my left hand side. It's basically the same as a combination wrench or a box wrench. It's open-ended on one side and closed on the other. So I'm going to place that around the drive shaft of the blade until it seats, spin it until it seats. And then with the box wrench, the closed section, I'm going to grab onto the nut and pull it apart. Then I can let go of the wrenches, and just like with the table saw, the parts are all the same. They're just a lot bigger. So I'm taking the nut off of the blade as we watch this, being careful not to drop it inside of the saw. And then there's a plate that this nut sits on top of that clamps it against the arbor of the saw. Now I can slide the blade off of its drive shaft. This blade is completely toast. You can see how it's been burned through. I'm looking at the teeth here, trying to inspect for damage. The teeth on this saw are mostly okay, but there's one that's not. It has definitely been burned through. We ripped a lot of 2x4 with this saw down to 1x for a show we did this summer, and the friction, the blade passing through that much lumber over time heated up so much, and you can see where it's burnt on the surface of the blade here. Now we're going to place this brand new DeWalt blade onto the saw. It's just the reverse of what we did to take the first blade off. I'm going to drop the blade over the drive shaft and slide it up against the shoulder. Place the collar back on, and then finger tighten the nut until the blade just barely starts to spin. And then, now that it's finger tight, I'm going to wrench it and really get that blade secure. I don't have to worry about super tightening it because, again, it's counter threaded, so as it spins, it will tighten. What I'm doing here, this card is magnetic and just lives on the fence of the saw. With this card, it allows me to set and make sure that the distance between the blade where it sits and spins and the aluminum brake cartridge that is for the safety of the user to stop it from cutting things that are conductive. If that blade spins and barely contacts the card, the saw and brake are set appropriately. Now I'm getting ready to put the saw back together. The first thing that I need to do is drop the blade guard into its slot and clamp it down, and then insert the blade guard. Whenever I test a saw blade for the first time after I've changed it, I like to drop it down as low as it can go, so if something were to go wrong and the blade were to wobble or vibrate and hit something it was unintended to, it would stay within the confines of the saw. I'm putting the blade changing tools back where they belong. Blade guard down, so if the blade were to explode, it couldn't harm me. Now the saw is set so that I can turn it on and run a piece of lumber through it. The saw is spinning. And is now cutting much more smoothly and quickly and efficiently than it was before. The next saw that I want to talk about is the chop saw. The chop saw of all of our saws is the most painful to change a blade on. Not only does the arm raise and lower, you have the blade guard to contend with, and a bunch of pieces that you actually have to take off in order to be able to manipulate the blade out of the saw. Here, obviously, is where the audio on the saw started working properly. I was really struggling with trying to change this blade. The tool that is to the right-hand side of the saw releases a plate on the left-hand side of the saw, and that's what I'm struggling with here. The plate that is connected to the blade guard there makes it so that you are unable to take off the bolt that holds the screw to its arbor. Now I have taken the parts of the guard off that allow me to take the blade off here. I'm going to remove the screw, or the bolt rather. Take the blade off. Put our new blade back in. And our little spacer. Put the spacer in first, maybe. There we go. While we're here, just clean some of the gunk out in here. Blade. Back on. And now we can tighten our bolt back down. Again, it's counter-threaded, so it's counterintuitive to which way you want to spin it. So, finger tight. And then rest of the way with the box wrench. That's good. Tighten our screws back down. Well, before we tighten it down, we'll put the guard back in the right place. Tighten it down. That one's tight. That one's tight. We want to secure this back in place. And check that it. Excellent. So that's the blade replaced. Okay, now that we have the saw Plug back in. We're going to test the blade. And it's fantastic. So now we're going to take a test cut. And it cuts much better. Thank you for watching this episode of Tool Time with Professor Levy.